What starts as a simple bank visit turns into a battle for justice. Jamal Wright, a successful architect, walks into a bank to deposit his hard-earned check, but instead, he's met with suspicion and humiliation. Wrongly accused, removed by security, and forced to defend his integrity, Jamal faces a choice. Walk away quietly or fight back against the system that targeted him. Will he stand up and demand justice, or will the forces working against him prevail? If you want to find out what happens next in Jamal's fight for dignity, subscribe, leave a comment, and don't forget to turn on notifications to follow his powerful journey. What do you think will happen next? Join the conversation. The sun hung high in the sky, pouring relentless heat onto the bustling streets below. Jamal Wright stepped out of his car, straightening his shirt and adjusting his tie before heading towards the large glass doors of Liberty National Bank. A wave of hot air hit him as he crossed the pavement, but Jamal barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, a quiet hum of satisfaction vibrating through him. He had just completed his biggest project yet, a major architectural design for a tech company's new headquarters. Today he was here to deposit the final payment, a sizable check that represented months of hard work. Jamal wasn't one to boast, but the sheer scale of the project and the recognition that came with it was something he was proud of. It was no small feat, being a black man in an industry dominated by others who rarely looked like him. He had faced his share of hurdles, but his skill and perseverance had brought him success, despite the challenges. Pushing open the bank's glass doors, Jamal was hit by a rush of cold air conditioning. The polished marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the familiar buzz of activity filled the air. He glanced around, nodding politely at the security guard stationed near the entrance. The guard, a bulky man in his mid-40s, gave him a nod in return, though Jamal couldn't help but notice the brief flicker of curiosity in the man's eyes. Jamal had been a customer at this branch for years. He had never had any problems here. The staff was professional, and the transactions were always smooth. Today should be no different. He made his way towards the teller line, taking his place in the queue. "Next," a friendly voice called. Jamal stepped forward, greeting the young Latina teller behind the counter with a smile. Samantha Hall was new to the branch. He had only seen her a few times before, but she was always polite and professional. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wright," Samantha said warmly, recognizing him from previous visits. "How can I help you today?" Jamal pulled the check from the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and slid it across the counter. "I'd like to deposit this," he said, keeping his tone casual, though the check represented a significant moment for him. Samantha's eyes widened slightly as she glanced at the amount, but she quickly composed herself, tapping away at her keyboard. "That's a nice amount," she said with a polite smile. "Congratulations." "Thanks," Jamal replied, leaning slightly against the counter as she processed the check. Everything was going smoothly, just as he had expected. It felt good to know that all his hard work was paying off, in more ways than one. As Samantha continued typing, Jamal glanced around the bank, taking in the familiar surroundings. It was a busy day, with customers lined up at the ATMs and a few people sitting in the waiting area for appointments. Jamal's mind began to drift back to his next project, another major commission that was set to start in a few weeks. Things were looking up. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Brian Mitchell, the branch manager. Tall with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, Brian had a reputation for being meticulous and somewhat aloof. Jamal had dealt with him once or twice before, but their interactions had always been brief and professional. Today, though, something about Brian's demeanor felt different. As the manager glanced in his direction, Jamal saw the change in his expression, a slight tightening of the lips, a narrowing of the eyes. Jamal could feel the shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Brian Mitchell stepped out of his office, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he made his way toward the counter. His face was carefully neutral, but there was something in his gaze that made Jamal's stomach tighten. "Excuse me, Samantha," Brian said smoothly, stepping beside the teller. "I'll handle this." Samantha hesitated, her fingers still hovering over the keyboard. "I've almost processed it, Mr. Mitchell. Just another moment." "I said I'll handle it," Brian cut in, his tone polite but firm. There was no room for argument. Samantha gave Jamal an apologetic glance as she stepped back, allowing Brian to take over. Jamal's smile faded. Something about this felt off. He straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as Brian picked up the check and examined it with an exaggerated level of scrutiny. "This is quite a large amount," Brian said, his tone casual, though there was an underlying edge to his words. He glanced up at Jamal, his eyes flicking over him with barely disguised suspicion. Jamal felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's a legitimate check," he said evenly. "Payment for a project I completed." "I'm sure it is," Brian replied, though the way he said it left little doubt about what he truly thought. He placed the check back on the counter, crossing his arms and leaning forward slightly. "But you understand that when we see something like this, we have to ask questions." Jamal's grip on the edge of the counter tightened. He knew where this was going. He had seen it before, felt it before, though he had hoped that things would be different now. "What kind of questions?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge. "Oh, just the usual," Brian said, his smile thin and unconvincing. "Where did the check come from? What kind of work do you do?" "I'm an architect," Jamal replied, keeping his voice steady. "This is payment for a design project." Brian didn't move. He studied Jamal for a long moment, as if weighing whether to believe him. The smile remained on his face, but it felt more like a mask than anything genuine. "I see," he said slowly. "And the company that issued this check, do you have any documentation to prove the legitimacy of the transaction?" Jamal felt a chill run through him despite the cool air of the bank. Documentation? He'd never been asked for that before. Not once in all the years he'd been banking here. "The check itself is proof," he said, his voice firmer now. "The bank can verify it." "Of course," Brian said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But you know, we've had situations in the past where people have tried to pass off questionable checks. It's important to make sure everything is above board." There it was, the unspoken accusation, veiled behind a thin layer of politeness. Jamal had heard it all before, in different forms, in different places. But it always boiled down to the same thing. "You don't belong here." Jamal drew a deep breath, steadying himself. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to suggest, but I'm here to deposit a check. That's all." Brian's smile faded, the polite veneer slipping slightly to reveal something colder beneath. "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Wright. I'm just making sure everything is in order." The tension between the two men was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Jamal could feel the eyes of other bank customers on him now. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had dealt with situations like this before, people questioning his success, his right to be where he was, but he wasn't going to let this man push him into a confrontation. "You can verify the check," Jamal said firmly, his voice low but controlled. "I'm not leaving until you do." Brian raised an eyebrow, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Sir, I suggest you lower your tone." Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Brian took the check in his hand and folded his arms, stepping back slightly. "I think we'll need to take a closer look at this," he said, his voice now fully devoid of any pretense of friendliness. "If you'll just wait here for a moment, I'll be right back." Jamal's eyes flicked toward the door, where two security guards stood nearby. Their eyes were already on him, watching him closely. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt the frustration rising inside him. He knew exactly what was happening, and it had nothing to do with the check. As Brian walked away, the check still in his hand, Jamal leaned against the counter, forcing himself to breathe slowly. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jamal watched as Brian Mitchell disappeared into the back of the bank, still clutching the check. The air felt heavier now, charged with the weight of assumptions and silent accusations. Jamal tried to focus on his breathing, to keep himself calm, but it was hard to ignore the feeling of being watched. He could feel the eyes of the other customers, their murmurs floating around him like faint whispers. A few feet away, Samantha, the teller, glanced at him with a sympathetic look. She seemed uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her fingers nervously tapping on the counter. Jamal caught her eye, and she offered him a weak smile. "I'm really sorry about this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen you come in here before. I've never seen anything like this happen with your transactions." Jamal nodded, appreciating her attempt at solidarity, though it didn't do much to ease the anger simmering beneath his skin. He didn't say anything, just gave her a brief nod before turning his gaze toward the front doors, where the two security guards stood. One of them, a tall, muscular man with a buzz cut, was now speaking quietly into his walkie-talkie, casting occasional glances in Jamal's direction. The feeling in the pit of Jamal's stomach twisted. He had been in the situations like this before, too many times to count. It always started the same way. Small looks, subtle shifts in tone, questions that didn't need to be asked. It always ended with the same silent conclusion. "You don't belong here." Minutes passed. The hum of the bank continued, people going about their business, oblivious to the tension building around Jamal. Every second felt like a deliberate delay, like Brian was drawing out the process on purpose. And every second that passed only made Jamal feel more and more like he was the one on trial. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Brian reappeared from the back office. His expression had changed, the polite veneer gone. In its place, there was a colder, harder look. He walked up to the counter, the check still in his hand, but his grip on it was tighter now, almost as if he were guarding it. "I've decided to handle this personally," Brian said, his voice steady but dripping with condescension. "There's something about this check that just doesn't sit right with me." Jamal blinked, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Brian could hear him. "What exactly is it about the check that doesn't sit right with you?" Brian's expression didn't change. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I think you know what I'm talking about." Jamal's jaw tightened, the weight of Brian's implication hitting him like a blow to the chest. "Someone like you," that's what Brian was really saying. It was the same message he had heard too many times before, the same subtle way of telling him that his success, his presence, was somehow suspicious. "No, I don't know," Jamal said, his voice now laced with controlled anger. "Why don't you tell me?" Brian let out a slow breath, his lips curling into a thin, almost mocking smile. "Let's not play games, Mr. Wright. A check of this size, well, we have procedures in place for situations like this." Jamal took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Situations like what?" For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension between them crackled in the air, drawing the attention of nearby customers and bank staff. Samantha looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot behind the counter, unsure of what to do. The security guards were still by the door, watching Jamal closely, their postures tense. Brian finally spoke, his voice calm but cold. "It's unusual for someone like you to walk in with a check this large. We need to make sure it's not fraudulent." The words hit Jamal like a punch in the gut. He could feel the heat rising in his face, his breath coming faster now. There it was, the real reason behind all of this. Someone like you. It wasn't just about the check. It was about him, about who he was, about the assumptions that people like Brian made every day. "You're accusing me of fraud?" Jamal asked, his voice steady but filled with barely restrained anger. Brian didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Jamal's, his smirk widening just slightly. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just saying we need to be cautious when handling such large sums of money. It's protocol, you understand?" "Protocol," Jamal scoffed, his frustration boiling over. "I've been banking here for years. You can check my account records. I've never had an issue." Brian shrugged as if that detail was irrelevant. "Times change. Protocols change. And this check, it just doesn't add up." Jamal took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, though he kept them under control. His voice was low but firm. "What doesn't add up is why you're treating me like a criminal for trying to deposit money that I earned." Brian's smile faded completely, his face hardening. "Sir, I suggest you calm down. There's no need to get hostile." "I'm not hostile," Jamal said, his voice rising slightly, though he tried to keep himself in check. "I'm just trying to understand why you're accusing me of something I haven't done." Brian's tone was now ice cold. "If you can't verify where this check came from, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." Jamal could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His frustration was nearing its breaking point. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal, like his very presence in this bank was something to be questioned about. "I don't need to verify anything," Jamal said, his voice cold and steady now. "The check is real. Call the company and verify it yourself." Brian raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "That's not how we do things here. We'll be holding on to the check for further review." Jamal's fist clenched again, the muscles in his arms tightening as he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let Brian win, wasn't going to let him push him out. Not this time. "You're not holding on to anything," Jamal said, his voice firm. "You're going to deposit that check." Brian's eyes darkened, his face twisting into something that looked more like a sneer than a smile. "Sir, if you continue to act this way, I'll have no choice but to ask security to remove you from the premises." Jamal stared at him, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He could feel the eyes of the security guards on him again, feel the judgment in Brian's every word. This wasn't just about the check anymore. This was about something bigger, something that went deeper than just one transaction. "I'm not leaving," Jamal said firmly. "I'm staying right here until you do your job." For a moment there was silence. The tension between the two men had reached its peak, and for the briefest moment, neither of them moved. Then with a slow, deliberate step, Brian backed away from the counter, raising his hand slightly as he glanced toward the door. "Security!" he called, his voice calm but commanding. Jamal turned just in time to see the two security guards approach. Their steps were slow but purposeful, their eyes trained on him as if he were already guilty of something. The air in the bank had shifted. What had once been a calm, professional environment was now thick with tension, all eyes locked on the unfolding drama. Jamal felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he wasn't going to back down. He had worked too hard, come too far, to be pushed around like this. He wasn't going to let them treat him like a criminal, not for something as simple as trying to deposit his hard-earned money. "Sir," one of the guards said as they reached him, his voice low but firm, "we're going to have to ask you to leave." Jamal stood on his ground, his eyes locked on Brian. "I'm not leaving until you deposit my check." The guard's expression didn't change. "Sir, please don't make this harder than it has to be." Jamal clenched his fists, forcing himself to take a deep breath. His mind raced with anger and disbelief. This was supposed to be a simple transaction, a routine visit to the bank. And now it had spiraled into something much worse, something familiar, something that cuts much deeper than just a check. Brian stood off to the side, his arms crossed, a smug look of satisfaction on his face. He wasn't saying anything now, but he didn't have to. The message was clear. "You don't belong here." Jamal felt the anger boiling up inside him, but he knew he couldn't let it out. Not here, not like this. He had seen what happened when black men let their anger show in situations like these. He wasn't going to give them an excuse to escalate this any further. "I'm not leaving," Jamal repeated, his voice steady. "You can verify the check right now. Call the company. It's real." The second guard stepped forward, his hand resting on the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. "Sir, we don't want to have to use force. Please cooperate." Jamal's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice even. "I'm not causing a disturbance. I'm not raising my voice. I'm asking for what any customer would ask for." The guard hesitated, glancing at Brian, who nodded slightly. That was all the signal they needed. Before Jamal could react, the guards grabbed him by the arms, their grip firm but not painful. They were moving quickly, professionally, but the humiliation of it was undeniable. Jamal could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, feel their judgment and curiosity. He wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't right, that he had done nothing wrong. But he knew it wouldn't help. He knew that to them, at that moment, he was already guilty of something. Guilty of being black, of having too much success, of not fitting the mold they expected. "You're going to regret this," Jamal said, his voice low but filled with fury, as they dragged him toward the door. Behind him, Brian stood at the counter, his arms still crossed, his face still smug. He didn't say a word as the guards escorted Jamal out of the bank. Jamal's feet hit the hot sidewalk outside, the sweltering heat of the day slamming into him like a wall. The guards released him, and he stumbled slightly, catching himself before turning back toward the bank. The glass doors slid shut behind him with a quiet hiss, sealing him out, cutting him off. Jamal stood there, his chest rising and falling with deep, frustrated breaths. People walked by on the sidewalk, glancing at him curiously, but no one stopped. No one intervened. To them, he was just another man on the street, another man who didn't belong. Jamal stood outside the bank, his chest still heaving as the heavy glass doors slid shut behind him. The rush of heat from the summer sun was nothing compared to the fire burning inside him. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. How had a simple bank transaction spiraled so quickly out of control? He ran a hand over his face, glancing at the reflection of the bank's imposing glass windows. Behind them, people went on with their lives. Customers making withdrawals, staff moving papers, a world continuing without them. But he felt isolated, standing on the hot sidewalk, separated from that world by an invisible but impenetrable wall. As Jamal stared at his own reflection, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. The humiliation was too fresh, too raw. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just trying to deposit a check, for God's sake. But that's not how Brian Mitchell saw it. No, to Brian, Jamal wasn't just a customer. He was someone suspicious, someone who didn't belong, someone who needed to be put in his place. Jamal clenched his fists, feeling his pulse quicken. He could still see the smug expression on Brian's face as the security guards had dragged him out of the bank. That expression was burned into his memory now, like Brian was daring him to push back, daring him to lose control so that he could have him arrested. The thought sent a cold shiver down Jamal's spine. He knew how these situations played out. He'd seen it happen to others, seen it on the news too many times. A black man raises his voice, defends himself, and suddenly he's the problem. The police are called, hands are forced into cuffs, lives are ruined, but not this time. Jamal wasn't going to let Brian win. He wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of breaking him. He had come too far, worked too hard, to let someone like Brian Mitchell take that away. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back to the present. Jamal pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from his wife, Rachel. "Where are you? Everything okay?" Jamal hesitated for a moment before typing back a quick reply. "I'm fine, just at the bank. Something came up. I'll explain when I get home." He stuffed the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. There was no use standing here, stewing in his anger. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what to do next. But one thing was certain. He wasn't just going to let this slide. Jamal turned on his heel, walking away from the bank. His mind was already spinning with options. He needed to talk to someone, maybe his lawyer, Olivia Johnson. Olivia had helped him negotiate contracts for his architecture firm, but she was also known for taking on civil rights cases. She would know what to do. But more than that, Jamal knew he needed to make this public. He couldn't let Brian Mitchell hide behind the bank's walls, pretending like nothing had happened. He needed to expose what had happened here, to make sure that others knew about the discrimination he'd faced. As Jamal walked down the street, his frustration slowly transformed into determination. He had been thrown out of the bank, treated like a criminal for simply existing, but he wasn't going to stay silent. He wasn't going to let Brian Mitchell or anyone else get away with this. By the time Jamal made it home, his anger had cooled slightly, but the fire still simmered beneath the surface. The house was quiet when he stepped inside, the faint smell of dinner lingering in the air. He could hear the soft hum of the dishwasher from the kitchen. "Jamal?" Rachel's voice called from the living room. Jamal closed the door behind him, tossing his keys onto the table in the entryway before making his way into the living room. Rachel was sitting on the couch, her dark curls pulled back into a loose ponytail, her eyes filled with concern the moment she saw him. "What happened?" she asked, setting down the book she'd been reading. Jamal sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a long story. I went to the bank today to deposit that check from the project and, well, things didn't go as planned." Rachel frowned, motioning for him to sit beside her. "What do you mean? Did something go wrong with the check?" "No," Jamal said, sitting down and resting his elbows on his knees. "Not with the check, with the manager." He recounted the entire encounter with Brian Mitchell, From the moment he handed over the check to being dragged out by security. He tried to keep his voice steady, but every word felt heavy, the weight of what had happened sinking in as he spoke. Rachel listened quietly, her expression growing darker with every detail. By the time Jamal finished, her hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. "They really did that?" she asked, her voice low but sharp with anger. "They treated you like a criminal?" Jamal nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, and the worst part is, I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to deposit a check, and Brian, he just saw me and assumed I was up to something." Rachel's eyes flickered with frustration. "This isn't right, Jamal. You can't just let them get away with that." "I know," Jamal said, leaning back against the couch. "That's why I need to talk to Olivia. She might be able to help. And I think we need to go public with this. People need to know what happened." Rachel nodded, her expression resolute. "You're right. This isn't just about you. This is about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Jamal felt a surge of relief at her words. He had been worried that going public might be too much, too risky, too personal. But Rachel's support gave him the confidence he needed. They had always been a team, and this was no different. "I'll call Olivia tomorrow," Jamal said. "See what our options are." Rachel reached over and squeezed his hand. "We'll figure this out, together." The next day, after a restless night, Jamal made the call to Olivia. Her voice was sharp and focused, the kind of no-nonsense tone that always made Jamal feel like he was in capable hands. "I'm sorry that happened to you, Jamal," Olivia said after he finished explaining the situation. "It's appalling, but unfortunately, not surprising." "I know," Jamal replied, his voice heavy. It shouldn't happen. Not in 2024, not to anyone." "You're absolutely right," Olivia said firmly, "and I'm glad you're ready to fight this. We can start by filing a formal complaint with the bank, but I think we should also consider taking legal action. This kind of racial profiling is exactly what we've been fighting against for years." Jamal nodded, even though Olivia couldn't see him. "What do you think about going public with this? I don't want to turn this into a spectacle, but people need to know." "I agree," Olivia said, "but we need to be smart about how we handle it. Let me reach out to a few contacts I have in the media. We'll find a way to get your story out there without sensationalizing it." "Thanks, Olivia," Jamal said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I appreciate it." "I've got your back, Jamal," Olivia replied. "We'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." After the call ended, Jamal sat on the edge of his bed staring out the window. His anger had faded into something else now, determination. He wasn't going to let Brian Mitchell's assumptions define him. He wasn't going to let the bank treat him like he didn't belong. This was about more than just a check. It was about standing up for his dignity, for his right to exist in spaces that had been denied to people like him for far too long. And with Olivia's help, he was going to do just that. A few days later, Jamal sat in the cafe across the street from Liberty National Bank, a cappuccino cooling in front of him. The bank loomed large across the street, its polished glass windows reflecting the sunlight. It looked peaceful, like nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened there. But Jamal knew better. Beside him sat Lauren Carter, a local journalist Olivia had recommended. Lauren was known for her hard-hitting pieces on civil rights and racial injustice. She had a reputation for digging deep and exposing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. "So, Jamal," Lauren began, her voice calm but focused, "I want you to tell me exactly what happened that day, from the moment you walked into the bank." Jamal took a deep breath, steadying himself before diving into the story once again. He had already told it to Rachel, to Olivia, to friends and family who had asked how he was doing. But this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just telling his story for himself. He was telling it to the public to hear. Lauren listened intently, taking notes on her tablet, occasionally glancing up to ask clarifying questions. Her eyes were sharp, and Jamal could tell she was already piecing the narrative together in her head. "And how did you feel when Brian called security?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Jamal paused, choosing his words carefully. "Humiliated, angry. I felt powerless. Like no matter what I said or did, he had already made up his mind about me. It wasn't about the check. It was about who he thought I was and who he thought I wasn't." Lauren nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's powerful. This isn't just about a bank transaction. It's about systemic racism, the way Black people are treated in public spaces, especially when it comes to money or success. Exactly, Jamal said. It's not just about me. It's about the message this sends to every person who walks into that bank and is judged because of the color of their skin. Lauren scribbled a few more notes before looking up at Jamal with a determined glint in her eyes. We're going to get your story out there, Jamal. People need to hear this, and once they do, Liberty National won't be able to ignore it. Jamal nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. He had been nervous about going public, about putting his personal experience out there for the world to see. But sitting here with Lauren, seeing the fire in her eyes, he knew he had made the right decision. Thanks, Jamal said quietly. I appreciate it. Lauren smiled, tucking her tablet into her bag. You're doing the right thing, Jamal. Trust me, this story is going to make waves. And she was right. Within days of the interview going live, Jamal's story spread like wildfire. Local news stations picked it up, and soon the hashtag number Justice for Jamal was trending on social media. People were outraged, calling for Liberty National Bank to take responsibility for what had happened. The days after the interview were a whirlwind. Jamal found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't entirely anticipated. What had started as a personal struggle was now a public conversation about systemic racism and discrimination in American institutions. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, messages of support from friends, strangers sharing their own stories, and even some hate-filled comments from those who accused him of playing the race card. Jamal had expected the backlash. Rachel had warned him it might happen, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that the truth was finally out in the open, and people were listening. Olivia had been in touch with the bank's legal team, who issued a statement that was more deflective than apologetic. They insisted that the bank followed standard protocol and that the situation with Jamal was an unfortunate misunderstanding. The words felt hollow, a corporate attempt to smooth over a problem they refused to fully acknowledge. But the public wasn't buying it. Protests started gathering outside Liberty National Bank's headquarters in the city, people holding signs that read "End Racial Profiling" and "Justice for Jamal." The attention only grew, with local politicians speaking out and social media campaigns pushing the issue further. What started as Jamal's personal fight was becoming a movement. One afternoon, as Jamal sat at the kitchen table, staring at yet another article about the protests, Rachel placed a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across from him. "You okay?" she asked softly. Jamal nodded, though the truth was he wasn't sure. The media attention was both validating and overwhelming. There was no escaping it now. Everywhere he looked, his face was on the screen, his story being dissected by pundits and bloggers alike. He had asked for this, but now that it was here, it felt heavy. "Yeah," Jamal said, giving Rachel a small smile. "I'm fine. It's just a lot." Rachel reached across the table, resting her hand on top of his. "You don't have to do this alone, Jamal. We're in this together. But if it gets to be too much, if you ever feel like it's not worth it..." Jamal shook his head. "It is worth it. It has to be." Rachel studied him for a moment before nodding, her expression softening. "Okay, just promise me you'll take care of yourself too." Jamal squeezed her hand. "I promise." His phone buzzed on the table, and Jamal glanced down to see a notification from Olivia. He opened the message, his heart rate picking up as he read her words. "The bank's legal team is requesting a meeting. They want to talk about a settlement." Jamal stared at the screen for a moment before looking back up at Rachel. "They want to settle," he said quietly. Rachel's eyes widened. "Already? That's a good sign, right?" Jamal wasn't sure. It could be a sign that the bank was feeling pressure from the public, that they wanted to resolve the situation quickly before it damaged their reputation any further. Or it could be their way of trying to sweep the entire incident under the rug. "I don't know," Jamal admitted. "I'll talk to Olivia about it. But I'm not interested in just taking a settlement and letting them off the hook." Rachel nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." The next day, Jamal met with Olivia in her office, the faint hum of the city outside her window, a backdrop to their conversation. Olivia sat behind her desk, her sharp eyes scanning the email from the bank's legal team. They're definitely feeling the heat, Olivia said, leaning back in her chair. They wouldn't be talking about a settlement this early if they weren't worried about how this is affecting their public image. Jamal frowned, shifting in his seat. So what's their play here? They give me a check and hope I go away? Essentially, Olivia said, crossing her arms. They're trying to contain the damage. If they settle with you, they'll probably ask you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. That way they can avoid a public trial and keep this from dragging out any further. Jamal shook his head. That's not what I want. This isn't about the money. It's about holding them accountable. Olivia nodded, her expression serious. I know, and that's why we need to be careful. They're going to push for a settlement because it's the easiest way for them to make this go away. But if you're willing to keep fighting, we can push this further. We can take this to court, demand real accountability. Jamal took a deep breath, weighing his options. The idea of a drawn-out legal battle was exhausting, but the thought of walking away with a settlement felt like a betrayal of everything he had been through. I want to fight, Jamal said finally. I want them to face the consequences of what they did. Olivia smiled, a look of approval in her eyes. Good. Then we'll keep pushing. I'll draft a response to their offer, but we're not backing down. The response from Olivia's legal team was clear. No settlement without accountability. They demanded that Liberty National publicly acknowledge their discriminatory practices, apologize, and commit to concrete changes to prevent future incidents of racial profiling. Days passed, and the bank's silence spoke volumes. They were hoping the story would blow over, that the public outrage would fade, and that they could move on without admitting any wrongdoing. But the pressure only continued to build. Every day, more and more people gathered outside the bank's branches, demanding justice for Jamal. Social media was ablaze with stories from other customers who had experienced similar discrimination at banks across the country. Jamal's case had struck a nerve, but while the public outcry was growing, Jamal's personal life was starting to feel the strain. The media attention was unrelenting. Reporters called constantly, wanting interviews, wanting to know how he felt, how he was coping. Jamal had become a symbol of something bigger than himself, and while he was proud of the fight he was waging, it was beginning to take a toll. One evening, after another long day of phone calls and meetings with Olivia, Jamal sat on the couch with Rachel, his head resting in his hands. Rachel was beside him, her hand on his back, rubbing slow circles as she tried to comfort him. I don't know how much more of this I can take, Jamal admitted, his voice low. It feels like I'm drowning in it. Rachel leaned in closer, her voice soft and soothing. You're not alone, Jamal. We're in this together, and you're doing something important. People are listening. I know, Jamal said, lifting his head to look at her, but it's just, every day it feels like it's getting bigger, like it's not just about what happened to me anymore. It's about all these people who have been through the same thing, and I'm supposed to represent them, to fight for them, but I didn't ask for that. Rachel's expression was filled with sympathy. You didn't ask for it, but you're doing it, and you're doing it well. I know it's hard, but you're making a difference. Jamal nodded, though the weight of it still pressed down on him. He had started this fight because of what had happened to him, but now it felt like the whole world was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. The pressure was enormous. And then, just when Jamal thought things couldn't get more complicated, Olivia called him with news that made his blood run cold. Jamal, Olivia said, her voice tense, I've just been informed that the bank has hired a PR firm to manage the fallout from this. They're starting to put out statements, and they're framing you as the aggressor. Jamal's grip tightened on the phone. What? They're spinning the narrative, Olivia explained. They're saying you became hostile during the encounter, that the security guards were justified in removing you from the premises. They're trying to paint you as the one who escalated the situation. Jamal felt his stomach drop. He had been bracing himself for the bank to push back. But this was worse than he had imagined. They're lying, Jamal said, his voice shaking with anger. I never raised my voice. I never made a scene. They were the ones who treated me like a criminal from the moment I walked in. I know, Olivia said, but they're trying to discredit you. They know they can't win in the court of public opinion if people believe you, so they're trying to shift the narrative. Jamal's mind raced. He could feel the panic rising in his chest. This wasn't just about what had happened in the bank anymore. Now they were attacking his character, trying to turn him into the villain in his own story. "What do we do?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We keep fighting," Olivia said firmly. "We counter their narrative with the truth, and we make sure the public knows exactly what happened. Don't let them intimidate you, Jamal. We're going to win this." But despite Olivia's confidence, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in his chest. The bank was playing dirty, and they had resources: PR firms, lawyers, media connections. Jamal was just one man. How could he fight them and win? As he hung up the phone, Rachel looked at him, concern etched into her features. "What is it?" "They're trying to turn this against me," Jamal said, his voice hollow. "They're saying I was the one who caused the disturbance. They're trying to make me look like the bad guy." Rachel's eyes darkened with anger. No, they don't get to do that. You didn't do anything wrong, Jamal. Everyone knows that." "But what if they believe it?" Jamal asked, his voice breaking. "What if people start believing their version of the story?" "I can't fight them. I'm just one person." Rachel reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "You're not just one person, Jamal. You're the truth. And no matter how hard they try to twist things, the truth will come out." Jamal closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He had come too far to back down now. The bank might have their PR firms and lawyers, but Jamal had something stronger: the truth. And he was going to fight like hell to make sure everyone heard it. The days following the bank's smear campaign were some of the most challenging of Jamal's life. Every time he turned on the TV or scrolled through social media, he saw discussions about the incident at Liberty National. Some pundits were sympathetic, recognizing the clear racial bias in the way Jamal had been treated. Others, however, latched onto the bank's version of the story, painting Jamal as a disgruntled customer who had overreacted and caused a scene. It was infuriating. The truth was being twisted before his eyes, and the very thing he had feared was happening. People were starting to doubt him. Jamal sat in Olivia Johnson's office, staring at the legal documents spread across the table. Olivia was going through their strategy, but Jamal's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were tangled in frustration, anger, and a growing sense of helplessness. "Jamal?" Olivia's voice broke through his thoughts. She looked at him, her expression softening. "Are you with me?" Jamal blinked and nodded. "Yeah, sorry, it's a lot." Olivia sighed and leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "I know it is. What they're doing is disgusting, but we're not going to let them get away with it." Jamal let out a long breath. "I just don't understand how they can lie like this. How can they twist the truth so easily?" "Because that's what they do," Olivia said, her voice hardening. "They have money, power, and a whole team of people whose job is to make sure the truth doesn't matter. But we have something they don't: evidence." She tapped the folder on the table in front of her. "I've been working with a private investigator to gather statements from other customers who witnessed what happened. We've also got footage from the bank's security cameras that clearly shows you didn't raise your voice or cause a disturbance. All of that will come out in court." Jamal nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope. "But what about the court of public opinion? They've already made up their minds." Olivia leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "That's why we need to control the narrative. We can't let them define you. We need to show the world who you really are. A man who's been wronged, a man who's fighting for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who's been through the same thing." Jamal looked down at his hands, the weight of her words sinking in. He had wanted to fight this battle quietly, to let the legal system do its job, but that wasn't enough anymore. The bank had turned this into a public spectacle, and now he had no choice but to fight back in the same arena. "What do you need me to do?" Jamal asked, his voice steady. Olivia smiled, a determined glint in her eyes. "We're going to start with a public statement, something that pushes back against their lies and reminds people of the real issue here: racial profiling and discrimination. Then we'll prepare for the trial." Jamal felt the weight of what lay ahead, but for the first time in days, he also felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about sending a message that people like Brian Mitchell, people who use their power to belittle and discriminate, couldn't get away with it anymore. The press conference was set for the following week. Olivia had arranged it at a small community center in Jamal's neighborhood, a symbolic location that felt closer to home and far from the sleek corporate image Liberty National Bank projected. As the day approached, Jamal's anxiety grew. He wasn't used to speaking in front of crowds, much less the media. But this was necessary. This was the fight he had chosen. Rachel stood by his side as they arrived at the center, her hand firmly gripping his. "You've got this," she said softly. "Just speak from the heart." Jamal smiled at her, though his stomach was twisted in knots. He could see the reporters gathering outside the building, their cameras and microphones ready. The protests outside Liberty National had intensified since the bank's smear campaign began, and Jamal knew that today would either solidify his position or let the bank's lies take hold. Inside the center, Lauren Carter, the journalist who had broken the story, greeted them. "You're going to do great, Jamal," she said, her smile encouraging. "The public is on your side. They're just waiting to hear from you." Jamal took a deep breath and nodded. Olivia was already at the podium, organizing her notes and speaking with members of the press. As he watched her work, Jamal felt a sense of gratitude. He wasn't alone in this. He had people in his corner, Olivia, Rachel, Lauren, and that gave him strength. When it was time, Jamal stepped up to the podium. The bright lights of the cameras flashed in his eyes and the room buzzed with anticipation. He took a moment to collect his thoughts before speaking, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Good afternoon," Jamal began, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Thank you all for being here today. I never imagined that a routine visit to the bank would lead to this. But what happened to me at Liberty National Bank is not just my story. It's the story of countless other Black men and women who have been treated with suspicion, disrespect, and discrimination simply because of the color of their skin." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye on him. "I went to deposit a check, money I earned through months of hard work. But instead of being treated like any other customer, I was treated like a criminal. The bank manager assumed I didn't belong there. He questioned my legitimacy, my right to even be in that space. And when I stood my ground, they called security and had me removed from the building." Jamal's voice grew stronger as he continued, the anger he had kept buried rising to the surface. "Liberty National has since tried to paint me as the aggressor. They've twisted the story to protect themselves, to avoid accountability for their actions. But let me be clear, I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a disturbance. The only thing I did was refuse to be treated like I was less than." He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of his words hanging in the air. This was his moment to take control of the narrative, to reclaim his story. "I am not the first person this has happened to, and I won't be the last if we don't stand up and demand change. Racial profiling and discrimination are pervasive in our society, and they won't go away unless we call them out for what they are. Liberty National Bank has a choice to make. They can continue to hide behind their PR teams and legal jargon, or they can take responsibility for what they've done and make real changes to ensure this doesn't happen again." Jamal's voice softened as he reached the end of his statement, but the resolve in his words was clear. "I am not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. I will not be silenced, and I will not be dismissed." He stepped back from the podium, the room still quiet for a moment before the reporters began shouting questions. But Jamal didn't hear them. His heart was pounding, adrenaline rushing through him as he locked eyes with Olivia, who gave him a firm nod of approval. Rachel rushed up to him, wrapping him in a tight hug. "You were amazing," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. Jamal smiled, though his hands were still shaking. He had done it. He had spoken his truth, and now it was out there for the world to hear. As the trial date approached, the tension grew thicker. Jamal knew that the public statement had been powerful. He had received countless messages of support in the days that followed. But the courtroom was a different battlefield. This was where the real fight would happen, and it wouldn't be as easy as making a speech. Liberty National's legal team was formidable, and they weren't backing down. Their strategy was clear: discredit Jamal, question his character, and frame him as an unreasonable, hostile customer. But Olivia was ready. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, gathering evidence, building their case, and ensuring that every detail was airtight. The day of the trial arrived, and Jamal found himself standing outside the courthouse, staring up at the imposing building. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but Rachel's hand in his gave him the strength to move forward. "Let's go," Rachel said softly. "You've got this." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The media had packed the gallery, eager to cover every moment of the trial. Jamal sat beside Olivia, his heart pounding as the judge entered and the trial began. Liberty National's lawyers were slick and polished, their opening arguments carefully crafted to frame the incident as a misunderstanding. They emphasized the bank's protocols and procedures, insisting that the manager had acted out of caution, not bias. But Olivia wasn't about to let them get away with that. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "What happened to my client, Jamal Wright, was not an unfortunate misunderstanding," Olivia began. "It was a clear case of racial profiling and discrimination. Mr. Wright was treated with suspicion from the moment he walked into that bank, not because of his actions, but because of his appearance. He was questioned, humiliated, and ultimately removed from the premises, all because the bank manager didn't believe he had the right to be there." Olivia laid out the evidence with precision: testimonies from witnesses, security footage showing Jamal's calm demeanor, and expert testimony about the patterns of racial profiling in banking. She dismantled the bank's defense piece by piece, never losing her composure, but leaving no doubt about the truth of what had happened. When Jamal took the stand, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. The courtroom was silent as he was sworn in, every eye on him as he prepared to tell his story once again. Olivia's questions were straightforward, guiding him through the events of that day. Jamal spoke clearly, recounting the incident with the same calm, measured tone he had used during the press conference. But this time, there was a vulnerability in his voice that the jury couldn't ignore. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal said, his voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to deposit a check, like any other customer. But from the moment I walked in, I could feel it. The way the manager looked at me, the way he questioned everything I said. It wasn't about the check. It was about who I am." When Liberty National's lawyers cross-examined him, their strategy became clear. They tried to poke holes in his story, suggesting that he had been defensive, that he had misunderstood the situation. But Jamal held his ground. He didn't let them twist his words or make him doubt his own experience. By the time the trial concluded, Jamal felt exhausted, drained by the emotional toll of reliving the humiliation and anger. But he knew that he had done everything he could. Now it was up to the jury. The courtroom was now silent. The jury had been dismissed to deliberate, and Jamal found himself sitting in a small room with Olivia, Rachel, and his legal team, waiting for the verdict. The tension was unbearable. It felt like the longest wait of his life. Jamal sat on the edge of the hard wooden bench, his leg bouncing nervously as he stared at the floor. Rachel was next to him, her hand resting on his knee in a silent attempt to calm him. Across the room, Olivia was reviewing her notes, her expression focused and unreadable. "They've been out there a while," Jamal said quietly, his voice strained with anxiety. Olivia glanced up, her eyes softening as she met his gaze. "That's a good sign, Jamal. It means they're taking it seriously, weighing the evidence carefully." Jamal nodded, though the reassurance did little to settle the nerves twisting in his stomach. He knew Olivia was right, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. I don't know what I'll do if they don't see it," Jamal admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if they believe the bank's version of the story? What if all of this was for nothing?" Rachel squeezed his knee gently. "It wasn't for nothing, Jamal. No matter what happens, you stood up for yourself. You fought back. That matters." Jamal looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude for her constant support. Rachel had been his rock through this entire ordeal, never wavering, never doubting him, even when he had doubted himself. Olivia leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "Jamal, you've done everything you could. You've told the truth, and we've laid out the evidence. Now it's up to the jury. But whatever happens, know that you've made a difference. You've forced this issue into the spotlight, and people are paying attention." Jamal took a deep breath. trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He knew they were right, but the fear of losing of having his dignity stripped away all over again was overwhelming. Time dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Jamal alternated between pacing the small room and sitting down, his thoughts racing. He kept replaying his time on the witness stand in his head, second-guessing every answer, every word. Had he been clear enough? Had he conveyed the truth of what happened? Or had Liberty National's lawyers managed to plant seeds of doubt in the jury's minds? Just as the weight of the waiting felt unbearable, a knock on the door startled them all. Olivia stood up quickly, her expression suddenly sharp with focus. A court officer stepped into the room, his face unreadable. "They've reached a verdict," he said simply. Jamal's heart skipped a beat, his breath caught in his throat as he exchanged a glance with Rachel, who stood beside him, her face a mix of hope and tension. "Are you ready?" Olivia asked. Her voice was calm but firm. Jamal nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd ever feel ready for this moment. Together they followed the court officer back into the courtroom. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The gallery was packed. The press gathered at the back, their eyes trained on Jamal as he walked to his seat. He could feel the weight of their stares, the anticipation in the air. But none of it matters now. All that mattered was the decision to be read. The jury filed back into the room, their faces somber and unreadable. Jamal's heart raced as he watched them take their seats, every nerve in his body on edge. His entire future, his dignity, his reputation, hung in balance. The judge, an older man with a grave expression, looked down at the jury foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood up and nodded. "We have, Your Honor." Jamal gripped the edge of the table in front of him, his palms slick with sweat. His breath felt shallow, his chest tight. This was it. The judge motioned for the foreperson to proceed. The courtroom was deathly quiet as she unfolded the piece of paper in her hands. "In the matter of Wright versus Liberty National Bank," the foreperson began, her voice steady, "we find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Jamal Wright." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom, but Jamal barely heard it. The words seemed to hit him all at once, flooding his senses, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. They had won. He had won. Rachel's hand tightened around his, her voice a soft whisper in his ear. "You did it." Jamal blinked, still processing what had just happened. Relief washed over him in waves, so powerful it almost brought him to tears. He had been bracing himself for the worst, but now, in this moment, it felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The judge continued speaking, outlining the damages Liberty National Bank would have to pay, both for emotional distress and punitive damages. But Jamal wasn't thinking about the money. All he could focus on was the victory, the vindication. The jury believed him. They had seen through the bank's lies and recognized the truth. As the judge concluded, Jamal glanced over at Olivia, who gave him a small, triumphant smile. Her calm, professional demeanor didn't falter, but Jamal could see the pride in her eyes. When the judge dismissed the courtroom, the tension broke, and a flood of emotions rushed over Jamal. Reporters immediately began shouting questions, but Olivia and Rachel shielded him as they made their way outside. Outside the courthouse, the sky was a brilliant blue, the sun shining brightly as if to celebrate Jamal's victory. The press gathered in a swarm, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward him, but Olivia quickly directed them to a designated spot for a brief statement. Jamal stood in front of the microphones, Rachel by his side, with Olivia just behind them. His heart was still pounding from the verdict, but this time, the adrenaline was fueled by triumph. "This is a victory," Jamal began, his voice clear and steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "Not just for me, but for every person who has ever been treated unfairly, who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong because of the color of their skin." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "What happened to me at Liberty National Bank was wrong. It was discrimination, plain and simple. But today the jury saw the truth. They saw that I was treated unfairly, that I was profiled, and they held the bank accountable. And that's what this fight has always been about, accountability." Jamal glanced at Rachel, feeling her hand in his. She smiled, her eyes filled with pride. This isn't the end of the fight, Jamal continued. This is just one step. There are still so many people out there who face this kind of discrimination every day, in ways big and small. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting for change, so that no one else has to go through what I went through. He stepped back from the microphones, his heart lighter than it had been in months. The reporters shouted more questions, but Olivia quickly wrapped things up, guiding Jamal and Rachel away from the crowd. As they walked down the steps of the courthouse, Jamal felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It wasn't just the victory in court. It was the knowledge that he had stood up for himself, for his dignity, and for every person who had ever been made to feel small or unworthy because of who they were. Olivia caught up to him, a rare smile on her face. "You did it, Jamal. You stood your ground, and you won." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "We won. I couldn't have done it without you." "You're stronger than you realize," Olivia said, her voice warm. "Don't forget that." Later that evening, back at home, Jamal and Rachel sat together on their front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, a quiet, beautiful end to a day that had been anything but quiet. "I can't believe it's over," Jamal said softly, leaning back in his chair. Rachel smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's not over, but it's a big step. You fought for justice, and you got it. I'm so proud of you." Jamal closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her words wash over him. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it had been worth it. He had stood up for what was right, and he had won. But Rachel was right. The fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still change to be fought for. But tonight, sitting on his porch with the woman he loved, Jamal allowed himself to rest. He had faced down the system and won, and for now that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial rippled through the banking world. Liberty National Bank was forced to issue a public apology, not just to Jamal but to the broader community. They also announced that they would be implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees and revising their customer service policies to prevent future incidents of racial profiling. It was a start, but Jamal knew it wasn't enough. He had become something of a public figure now, a reluctant advocate for racial justice. Invitations poured in from media outlets, podcasts, and community groups, all wanting to hear his story and get his perspective on how to make real change. At first, the attention was overwhelming, but over time, Jamal found his footing. He realized that his voice mattered, that his story had the power to influence change in a way he had never imagined. One afternoon, Jamal sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the news on his phone. An article about Liberty National's new policies caught his eye, and he couldn't help but smile. They were being forced to make changes, real changes, because of the stand he had taken, and that felt good. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen to see a message from Rebecca Cole, the investigative journalist who had been one of the first to cover his story. She was asking if he would be interested in doing a follow-up interview now that the trial was over. Jamal smiled and typed back a quick reply. "Let's do it." He knew that the road ahead would still be challenging. There would always be more to fight for, more battles to win. But he was ready. He had proven to himself and to the world that he wasn't going to back down in the face of injustice. He had found his voice, and he wasn't going to let it be silenced. As he sat back, Rachel walked into the room, her warm presence filling the space. She leaned against the counter, a playful smile on her face. "What's next for you, Mr. Wright?" she teased. "Taking on the whole world?" Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "One step at a time. But yeah, maybe." Rachel laughed and crossed the room to sit beside him. "Whatever comes next, I know you'll handle it." "You always do." Jamal wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Thanks for believing in me. I couldn't have done this without you." Rachel smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You did it, Jamal, and I'll always believe in you." As they sat together in the quiet of their home, Jamal felt a deep sense of peace. The fight for justice was far from over, but he had taken the first steps. He had stood up, fought back, and won. And now, with Rachel by his side and a whole community behind him, he was ready for whatever came next. The road ahead was long, but Jamal knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking it alone. A few weeks had passed since the trial, but the sense of relief that came with the verdict still lingered in Jamal's mind. The victory had been significant, not just for him personally, but for everyone who had been watching. Liberty National's public apology and their promise to implement anti-discrimination training was a start. But Jamal knew it was only a small step in a much larger fight. Sitting at his desk in his home office, Jamal scrolled through emails, many of them from people he didn't know. Messages of support, personal stories from strangers who had experienced similar forms of discrimination. Each message felt like a reminder of why he had decided to fight this battle in the first place. One email in particular caught his eye. It was from a woman named Teresa Banks, someone he had never met. But her story was all too familiar. She had been denied a mortgage by her bank, despite having excellent credit and a stable job, simply because the loan officer had questioned her ability to handle such a large financial commitment. Reading her words, Jamal felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over him. How many others have gone through the same thing, in different forms? It was clear that the issue wasn't confined to just one bank, one manager, or one institution. It was everywhere. "Hey!" Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts as she stepped into the room, a cup of coffee in her hand. She set it down on the desk next to him, smiling softly. "You okay? You've been in here all morning." Jamal leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just going through some emails. It's overwhelming, you know?" Rachel sat on the edge of the desk, her eyes filled with understanding. "I can only imagine. But remember, you don't have to carry all of this on your own." "I know," Jamal said, though the weight of the responsibility still felt heavy. "It's just, there are so many people out there who have been through this. People like me, people like Teresa Banks, who reached out this morning. It's hard to not feel like I need to do something for all of them." Rachel nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You've already done something, Jamal. You fought your own fight and won. You brought attention to an issue that a lot of people were ignoring. But you can't solve everything. You don't have to." Jamal smiled, appreciating her constant grounding presence. "I know. I just don't want this to be the end. There's so much more to do." "Then do what you can," Rachel said softly, "one step at a time." Jamal took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. Rachel was right. He couldn't fix everything, but he could keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep speaking out. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. 2 months after the trial, Jamal found himself standing in front of a room full of people. He was at a community event organized by local leaders who had invited him to speak about his experience and the broader issues of racial discrimination in banking and other institutions. Public speaking had never been Jamal's favorite thing, but he had come to realize that his story had power, and sharing it was part of the fight. The event was being held at a community center, not far from where Jamal grew up. It felt like a full-circle moment, standing in front of the same kind of community that had shaped him, now using his voice to make a difference. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had gathered to hear him speak, Jamal felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This was where he was supposed to be, right here, standing up for what was right. "Thank you all for being here," Jamal began, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "A few months ago, I was in a very different place. I was just trying to deposit a check at my bank. It should have been a simple transaction, but it turned into something much bigger than that. I was treated with suspicion, humiliated, and ultimately removed from the bank because the manager didn't believe I belonged there." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. "I know that my story isn't unique," Jamal continued. "It happens to people all over the country, every day, whether it's being questioned at a bank, denied a loan, or treated differently in a store. Racial profiling and discrimination are real. They're part of the system, and they affect all of us." Jamal scanned the room, seeing heads nod in agreement, people leaning in to listen more closely. "But what I learned through my experience," Jamal said, his voice growing stronger, "is that we don't have to accept it. We can fight back. We can hold people accountable. It's not easy and it's not always quick, but it's worth it. Because when we fight for our dignity, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for the generations that come after us." The room erupted in applause, but Jamal wasn't finished. Liberty National Bank had to make changes because of what happened, Jamal said. They were forced to look at their own practices and recognize the damage they were doing. But it doesn't stop there. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep speaking out. And we have to demand that institutions treat all of us with the respect we deserve. When he stepped down from the podium, people came up to him, shaking his hand, thanking him for his words. Jamal felt a sense of fulfillment, not because of the attention, but because he knew his voice was making a difference. The fight wasn't over, but he was in it for the long haul. As he made his way to the back of the room, Lauren Carter, the journalist who had first told his story, caught up to him. "You were great up there," Lauren said with a smile. "The crowd really connected with what you had to say." Jamal nodded, still catching his breath. "Thanks, it's been a journey." Lauren handed him her card. "I'm working on a longer piece, looking at systemic racism in banking and other institutions. I'd love to include your story in it, more than just what we've already covered. Would you be up for that?" Jamal hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the card in his hand. He had come so far, and part of him was ready to step back, to let someone else take the spotlight. But he knew this was bigger than him. His story had opened doors, and maybe sharing it on a larger platform could keep those doors open for others. "Yeah," Jamal said, nodding. "Let's do it." A few weeks later, Jamal found himself back at the community center, this time attending a panel discussion on racial equity in financial institutions. He wasn't a speaker at this event. He was just there to listen and learn. It felt good to be on the other side, watching as other voices took the stage to share their experiences and insights. As the panelists discussed policies and practices that needed to change, Jamal's mind wandered to the future. He had already made a difference, but there was still so much more to do. He thought about the messages he had received from people like Teresa Banks, people who were still fighting their own battles, still trying to navigate a world that treated them unfairly because of their race. Jamal wasn't naive. He knew that change didn't happen overnight, but he also knew that progress was possible. His own journey had shown him that. The victory in court had been a huge step, but it was just the beginning. Now it was about continuing the fight, whether that meant advocating for policy changes, supporting others who had been discriminated against, or simply using his voice to keep the conversation going. After the panel, Jamal wandered outside into the cool evening air. The sky was beginning to darken, the first stars twinkling above. He found a quiet spot on a bench and sat down, taking a moment to reflect. Rachel joined him a few minutes later, slipping her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, her voice soft. Jamal smiled, glancing at her. "Just thinking about everything, about how far we've come and how far we still have to go." Rachel nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've done so much already, and you're going to keep doing great things. I know it." Jamal leaned into her, feeling the warmth of her presence. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done yet. There were still battles to fight, still voices to lift up, still work to do. As they sat together in the fading light, Jamal felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had faced injustice head-on and emerged stronger, more determined than ever to make a difference. The road ahead was long, but he wasn't walking it alone. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. The following year, Jamal stood in front of a room full of college students, guest lecturing at a business ethics class at a local university. The professor had invited him to speak about his experience with Liberty National Bank and how it related to corporate responsibility and racial justice. As he looked out at the eager faces of young people just beginning their own journeys, Jamal felt a sense of hope. The fight for justice was a long one. But here, in this room, were future leaders, future decision makers. If they could learn from his story, if they could take what he had experienced and use it to create a better, more just world, then it would all be worth it. "People always talk about ethics in business," Jamal said, his voice steady. "But what does that really mean? Is it just about following the rules? Or is it about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching? I learned firsthand that sometimes the rules are part of the problem. That's why it's important for all of us, in whatever we do, to push for real change, to hold people accountable, and to make sure that the systems we're part of are just and fair for everyone. The students listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity and empathy. Jamal could see the spark in some of them, the drive to make a difference. After the lecture, several students approached him, asking questions and thanking him for sharing his story. One student, a young woman with bright eyes, shook his hand and said, "Your story really inspired me. I want to go into finance, but I also want to make sure I'm doing it the right way, helping people, not hurting them." Jamal smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment. "That's the right mindset," he said. "Keep that with you, no matter where you go, and don't be afraid to speak up when something isn't right." As he left the university that day, Jamal felt lighter, more hopeful than he had in a long time. His journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, still voices to amplify, but he had come a long way. And now he knew that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the future. The road ahead stretched out before him, long and winding, but filled with possibility. And Jamal Wright was ready for it. Thank you for following Jamal's journey, a story about standing up for what's right and fighting for justice. If you enjoyed this story, and if you believe in the power of storytelling to spark change, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another video. By subscribing, you're supporting the message that everyone deserves respect and dignity, no matter where they come from or who they are. Let's keep this conversation going and continue making a difference together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.